Good morning. It's great to be here. Thank you for the generous introduction. Thanks to Holly, who is an old friend. I met Holly in 2009 when we at Drexel organized a meeting on ethics and risk communication. God, that was 7 years ago. That's crazy. So thank you for having me, and thanks to Ben Wilfon for helping to organize this, and of course to Liz, who is always a very tough act to follow. No? You're shaking your head, no. So, where's this thing? Okay. So my talk is about history, ethics, and understanding risk communication and autism. I am a historian by training who does work in ethics, who lives in a school of public health. And I'll just tell you briefly about our research team. John Rossi, my co-PI, several co-investigators are RAs. We had a great advisory board who assisted with this research, and Autism Speaks, despite that horrific commercial, which is 10 years old now, very generously funded this research. So they do get it right sometimes, I hope. So I want to start in a slightly different area. For some of you who know my work, it's in generally two very different areas of scholarship. One is in autism and ethics and history, and the other, I had a book out 2 years ago on the history of the race concept in genetics, and we had a paper in Science earlier this year calling for an end to the use of race as a classificatory tool in genetics research. I don't know if folks have been watching the news, but late last week in North Miami Beach, there was another incident where an African-American man was shot, an unarmed African-American man, in fact, lying on the ground with his hands up, shot by the police. This man, his name's Charles Kinsey. He is a behavioral therapist in a group home in Miami, and one of the individuals he was working with, a young man, a nonverbal young man with autism, left the group home, walked out into the street. He came after him. The police were called. Apparently somebody was trying to kill themselves, was the call that came in. Mr. Kinsey heroically tried to help this young man. The cop showed up with guns drawn and ended up shooting Mr. Kinsey in the leg. Thankfully, he was not killed. When the police originally met with Mr. Kinsey, the cop apparently said he did not know why he shot Mr. Kinsey. Later, the explanation was that he was defending Mr. Kinsey from the gentleman on the right. So we can see the ways in which justice manifests itself in real-world settings in terms of the perceptions of autistics and the threat that they are believed to pose in certain situations, and then as well the threat and the perceptions of African-American men in American society. So that is a truly disturbing image and event, and gratefully both men are okay. So I want to start with a little history. Yesterday's talk by Steve Silberman was terrific. I think he's written a great book, and he has helped propel the history of autism onto a global stage, and has gotten both folks in the autistic community and in the broader stakeholder community, as well as everyday folks thinking about the history of autism and its impact both in the past and also in the present. And I want to talk about Connor briefly, because Connor, as Steve said yesterday, remains credited with naming the disorder in 1943, which he did while a professor at Johns Hopkins. Connor was an interesting character, because Connor, who had been an emigre from Eastern Europe, came to the US, helped really define the field of child psychiatry in the 1930s, actually saw himself as doing something beneficial for children. And he delivered a speech in 1942 in Boston, about a year before his first paper on autism came out, where he called psychiatry a science dunked in the milk of human kindness. And in the longer paper, Connor talks about the way in which psychiatry, particularly child psychiatry, could rescue children who had been demeaned and mistreated and abused for generations with support from the field. And just a year later, he would name the diagnosis, I think initially with good intent, although by the end of the 1940s, after having believed that autism was a hereditary condition, changes his tune with the rise of psychoanalytic thought, and is really the progenitor of the refrigerator mother hypothesis that Silberman spoke about yesterday. The other piece of Connor that I think is worth considering are his own personal motivations. And in my research, I've found a really fascinating letter that he writes to Adolf Meyer, who is the chair of his department at Johns Hopkins. Also in 1942, this letter is written, where he says, "As I look around, I see that everyone of my age and comparative professional standing has reached a far higher academic, economic, or combined status than mine, which has been stationary for many years and offers no prospect of any kind of advancement possibility in my present niche. I feel left behind and I see no way out." So Connor's motivations for naming the disorder when he does also seem to be selfish to a degree, that he wants to propel himself forward in the eyes of his colleague, define this new condition, and help to redefine the treatment of individuals who had previously been diagnosed with childhood schizophrenia and feeble-mindedness, which was a eugenic category. And to me, what's so interesting about this is that Connor was not, his intentions, I believe, were not malicious. He was trying to do in his eyes and in the eyes of the broader society at the time something good for kids who had for generations essentially been locked away by psychiatry and treated instead of children as little people, little men and women. Now, of course, that reminds us that intentions often don't matter. It's outcomes that we need to be considering, and certainly Connor, over the course of his career, helps to give rise to some very awful ideas. Now that brings me to my current work, which is thinking about autism in the context of how scientists talk about their research findings, talk about and conceptualize risk, which is, we'll talk about in a second, a value-laden concept, which is very problematic in the context of autism. And it also, I think, helps us think about the way in which ethics, history, and autism relate to concerns today. So let's look at some of those concerns briefly before we dive into some of the results from our study. So autism in public health ethics brings up a number of issues. So one is what issues are most morally important to the public at large? We see this in the context of research. Should we, and Liz, you addressed this very well, should we be prioritizing cure? Should we be prioritizing treatment? Should we be prioritizing services? We see it in the way society responds to issues in autism and ethics. We see that in the vaccine debacle, in the rise of autism advocacy movements, in the rise, more recently, of the neurodiversity movement. We see it in the way the public interacts with scientific, medical, and public health institutions about demanding access to services, and again, also some of those examples around vaccines and advocacy and neurodiversity that I just mentioned. Next, it relates to how public health communicates uncertainty in causation. And of course, dating back to the early days of the naming of autism as a diagnosis, there was always so much surety in how and what caused autism. Connor originally believed it was hereditary, then he shifted to a psychogenic belief. Then we started to see in the late 50s and 1960s a pushback against that with biological research and genetic research with pedigree studies. Now we are more about autism as a complex trait with both environmental and genetic causes. Yet, when you read research studies dating back the 70, 80 years in the lifespan of the name diagnosis, we of course see scientists making very concrete claims about what does and what doesn't cause autism. Autism also brings us to think about how we define who is normal and who is diseased, and of course this relates to the neurodiversity movement. It relates to stigma by group association. One group could be celebrated, such as individuals with Asperger's, while another group might be stigmatized, as we saw in that awful video earlier. What's the role and impact of advocacy-influenced public health? Relates to the ethics of care, which groups get care, and finally, the value-ladenness of science and medicine. How do notions of disability, of parenting, of gender, of patriarchy, and of race and ethnicity, among others, shape scientific practice and shape both scientific and public thinking about autism? Finally, just a few historical themes in autism research and treatment. There has been this debate and divide, and again, we saw that in some of Liz's statistics about thinking of autism as a disease of the brain or a condition of the mind. We see tremendous uncertainty, often in the tremendous uncertainty in the context of autism research. What causes it? What are the best treatments? What types of services should be offered? We see historically a tremendous amount of controversy dating back to the naming of the disorder. We also see a tremendous amount of blame. The refrigerator mother was a blaming hypothesis, a blaming idea that wrought a lot of challenges and, frankly, awfulness on parents and children who were diagnosed with the condition during the refrigerator theory's decades-long reign in the autism world. And finally, eugenics has certainly more recently become a concern as more and more genetics research has been done around autism. So these themes all interact with ethical issues today. So we know from yesterday that historically the idea of a refrigerator mother, the idea that moms and sometimes dads who were emotionally cold drove their children into an emotionally frozen state, and only by, quote unquote, defrosting them could they be made whole again. This, of course, as a historian, what interests me is that this was, the science of the times. This was what was published in the leading journals of the time. So as a historian, it always gives me caution, for thinking about how science is conducted today. Now, of course, these ideas, and more recently, these ideas around the vaccine, around claims that vaccines, particularly MMR vaccine, caused autism, have shaped all of the discussions around autism, whether it be etiology research, treatment research, or services research today. What's interesting, I think, just to note briefly about the vaccine issue, is that in many ways the vaccine debacle was an inversion of blame, that you had for almost 40 years, 50 years, parents being blamed for their child's condition, and for a number of reasons, some of them relating to the rise of, the decline of medical authority from the 1970s through the 1990s, the rise of internet technology in the 1990s, which allowed parents to share their stories more readily, and of course the rise of anti-vaccine sentiment at a particular moment allowed people to come together, tell their stories, and the blame was reversed. So when scientists talk about etiology and they talk about treatment, they talk a lot about risk, and I'll talk about the concept of risk in a moment. But I want to just impress upon you, from my perspective, all of the history that I've discussed and that Steve Silberman discussed yesterday comes to bear on how scientists conceptualize autism as a condition, or sometimes a disease or a disorder, depending upon who is defining it. So risk communication focuses on the communication of risk-related information, either to provide understandable risk information to enhance the authenticity and autonomy of individual choices, or increase the uptake of a particular beneficial behavior, or decrease the exposure to factors or behaviors that cause negative health outcomes. Scientists have had a lot of trouble engaging in this type of language. And why is this relevant to autism? It's relevant to autism because a sizable and growing number of studies investigating potential genetic, environmental, and complex risk factors for ASD are out there, whether it be SSRI studies, maternal smoking, chromosomal studies. These studies are going on. And risk believed to be associated with ASD may be communicated in several contexts, whether it be clinical setting, around the return of results, the diagnosis, genetic counseling and recurrence risk, around research, for example, the return of results. The media is constantly talking about risk around autism. Autism is caused by such and such. We did a case study a few years ago in advance of the 2009 meeting where there was a paper published in Science about, it was a genome-wide association study. They identified several genes believed to be risk factors for autism. By the time that study hit the newspapers, it was claimed that 15% of autism cases are genetic, whereas the paper never actually said that. It was in the translation between the author to the media office to the network news that suddenly there was this new discovery that autism was a genetic condition. So this is a real challenge. And then, of course, person to person through social media or the internet. Why should risk communication be on autism stakeholders' radar? Well, for one, there's a pragmatic argument that ASD stakeholders need public support for their work. They're dependent upon grant funding, and if concerns arise and turn the public against science, then the work is potentially threatened. But more important, there's an ethical argument that if the communication of information or causes has the potential to cause problems, then ASD stakeholders have a moral obligation to consider the ethical implications of their research and role therein. So, just to pause briefly here, I want to make clear that the concept of risk itself presupposes that a bad outcome is to be avoided. This is, of course, value-laden. What about when it's a contestable judgment? And I think many of us in the room would argue that talking about autism as a risk is a contestable idea and that there are deep ethical challenges in thinking about autism in that way. It also forces us to consider, when we use the language of risk, what are we pathologizing and what are we considering to be normal? I would add that just because scientists and public health officials assume something is a risk, we shouldn't necessarily assume that it is. These are often moral judgments, not scientific ones. But there are those who would have an optimistic view of the discussions around autism risk information. It can lead to a better understanding of etiology. It can lead to earlier detection and intervention. There can be the development of targeted therapies. You can avoid risk if you know what risk may or may not exist. It can help explain things. It can help alleviate guilt. And it can help create more informed family and medical planning. But there's a flip side to this, which is the pessimistic view, which is that autism risk information may lead to disagreements over the meaning of neurodiversity. It may lead to offense. It may inadvertently lead message recipients to take actions not in their interests. It could lead to the alteration of individuals' identity. It can lead to consideration over the weight of evidence. And it can lead to inadvertent harm among message recipients, particularly issues around anxiety and worry, around guilt, and around blaming or stigmatizing message recipients. And we'll see some of that when I share with you some of the findings from our study. So we were interested, following the 2009 conference and following some papers that we wrote in the journal Autism, in the Kennedy Institute of Ethics Journal, and a few other places, about how do scientists handle the challenges of talking about their findings, particularly in the context of risk factor research when they're looking for risks for autism? How do parents, both of autistic children and of neurotypical children, think about this kind of research? And how do autistic individuals think about this research? So we conducted a mixed methods study. We began with a quantitative survey with more than 60 autism risk researchers. We sent the survey out to about 200, and we got 65 responses. We conducted 6 online focus groups with parents of children with and without an autism diagnosis. We followed up by conducting 10 in-depth interviews with autism risk researchers, and we conducted in-depth interviews with 4 autistic individuals. So from our data, several themes emerged, but before I jump into those, it's kind of hard to see, but You could see most of the individuals, most of the scientists in our study were epidemiologists, a smattering of environmental health researchers and geneticists, and then a mix of physicians and psychologists and biostatisticians and pediatricians. There was a mix of individuals in the field, whether they'd been less than 5 years or more than 5 years. Most of our subjects were in the US. We had a few from the UK, Denmark, Spain, Sweden, and other. So 7 themes emerged. The first is around the interest in and usefulness of autism risk information. As you can see, the scientists surveyed felt like their current research was relevant to the following audiences. For the most part, they saw their primary audience as being other scientists or policymakers and also families at high risk for autism. Those numbers begin to decrease until we see individuals with autism at around 65%. And then in our interviews and in our focus group, some interesting ideas around these issues came out. One researcher says parents of autistic children can't even think about risk factor research because it is cause. It is not treatment. So this scientist distanced himself from parents feeling like their work didn't apply to parents. Another said families with autism are hungry for a culprit. They are very eager for having something to point to. So you see some contradictions in researchers' perspectives. One parent felt, personally, I'm much more interested in what is the next step, what we can do now. He just turned 7. What are the developmental factors in his life today that need to be addressed? And what's the best possible way to tackle them? So much, much more forward-looking than backward-looking personally. Another parent says, it doesn't affect me, it doesn't relate to me, but if my son or either of my boys, since they're twins, were at the point where they were getting serious with someone and were thinking about getting married and starting a family, then I might have renewed interest in the whole thing about risk factors. Yeah. Another parent had a similar sentiment, but more about Down syndrome than autism. And then one autistic adult we spoke to had an interesting perspective where they said that on the one hand, risk factor research could stifle the recognition of beneficial autistic traits, but on the other hand, identifying what's causing autism can actually, if it ends up becoming useful, help us multiply the benefits as opposed to diminishing them. So again, very mixed perspectives on the usefulness of risk information. In terms of the prospective uses of this research, our scientists felt like clinicians who might educate parents and their families about autism risk, and that risk information could be used to avoid potential sources of risk in the lives of their children and future children. They also felt like, about 50% felt like risk information could be used to increase understanding and acceptance of autism in society, and also by persons to avoid sources of risk in their personal life. For now, about 50%, but in 15 years, hopefully, they thought more than 60%. And finally, one parent thought in terms of the usefulness of risk information. They said, I feel much of the conversation around autism has to do with vaccination. Not many people really fully understand the genetic or environmental risk factors. Like no one, even for those people who are anti-vaxxers, it's like, okay, well, it's not that, but then something's causing it, and what is it? And then you sit around the table going, I don't know, and like, how do you find that information? What's reputable? What's scientific? How do you have a conversation about that when you're not, especially when you're not a scientist and you're a parent or a person who's trying to get pregnant, and there's a whole other storm of emotions that go around with all of that. Trying to stay focused on the science of it and understand something that seems to be very elusive at this point is difficult. So again, lots of confusion about the meaning of risk and the applicability of risk research. The next theme that came out were around ideas of neurodiversity, that is, that autism is a natural variation in human development, and if you haven't read Steve's book, Steve makes a really powerful argument for thinking about autism in the context of neurodiversity. And our scientists in our survey had very interesting perspectives on this. Almost all felt that it was a priority to prevent adverse symptoms of autism from happening in the first place. and that they should be developing, that their findings could be used to develop therapies to mitigate the adverse symptoms of autism and reduce environmental exposures that may cause autism. A vast majority also thought that their findings could be used to prevent autism or cure autism. And this is, of course, in contrast to the ideas of neurodiversity. What did researchers say and what did individuals with autism say? Well, one of the individuals with autism that we spoke to said, why do researchers want to prevent autism? What is the problem? Everyone wants a perfect child and everyone wants to be perfect. A researcher said, we want to understand the biology and the pathophysiology so that we can maybe prevent autism in the future. And those people where we can't prevent it, we can come up with better interventions. But there's some aspect of being autistic that I'm especially thinking of very high-functioning people who, without people like that, we wouldn't have a lot of things we have in this world today. They don't necessarily lead suffering lives, so it's complicated. Another researcher said, it's my responsibility to do anything I can because the bottom line is if I can prevent one family from going through this horrible ordeal, then I have to do that. And then a parent says, the reality is that we have kids that need to be taken care of for the rest of their lives, and we're trying to come up with solutions to reality. We don't care about the cure if there is any, which I doubt there is. We're just worried about the day-to-day and worried about when we're dead and what's going to happen to our kids. The third theme that came out of our findings was around understanding effective communication of the science of environmental autism risk research. One researcher says, I think we have a responsibility to try to convey honestly what our findings are, which can be very hard. I don't think we're taught how to do that necessarily, and it's really easy for messages to get confused or to get simplified. It's not simple what we do. The research we do is not simple. The messages, our conclusions and inferences are not that simple, but yet that has to be distilled out in some way to convey it as a message to the public. But it's also hard to be honest about limitations with our research, with our findings, because I think sometimes limitations are misinterpreted by the public as skepticism by the researcher or poo-pooing even the researcher's own findings by the researcher themselves. So this researcher was really struggling with what to do with their findings, and that was a common theme in our discussions. Now, what was interesting, though, despite that sentiment, was where scientists placed blame for a misinterpretation of their findings. It was not with them, it was with the media. We'll see in a second, despite this, scientists do want help. And then researchers concerned about perceptions of research findings influencing communication practices. Scientists pay closer attention to the content or wording of their concluding statements. For anybody that's read a scientific paper, that last paragraph is where scientists always get themselves knee-deep in it, right? They've gone along, they've presented their findings, it's generally fairly neutral, and then in the last paragraph, it's, this is going to cure everything, folks. Look at me, here, take this out into the media. And there are selfish reasons for that. It's about funding, it's about tenure, it's about self-promotion, but then the media offices will oftentimes take what may be a sentence or two in a very long paper and promote it like crazy in a way that isn't commensurate necessarily with the findings or the broader consensus in the field. The fourth theme that emerged was around guilt, anxiety, and stigma. 61% of scientists were concerned that the communication of research findings might provoke anxiety. 52% were concerned that the dissemination of research findings might make people feel guilty or stigmatized. 25% felt that sometimes communicating scientific findings to the public might result in more harm than good because some research should only be discussed within the scientific community itself, which is an interesting finding itself. And 71% felt that sharing the research is likely to lead to more benefit than harm. Our fifth theme was around researcher responsibility to communicate confidence in communication skills. And we see that scientists had tremendous confidence in communicating their findings to other scientists. You can see the blue line is around current research, and then the green line is around the support and training they have around communicating those findings. So they feel well-trained and confident to communicate among their peers, but you can see the discrepancies between the green and the blue line as you move through some of these issues, particularly around families and individuals with autism and service providers. Scientists do not know how to speak to those audiences. So a parent of an autistic child says about these issues, I personally think that the pediatricians are the best possible situation to deliver autism risk information, and the educators at least the initial resource to get to that next resource. Otherwise, who else are we supposed to rely on if you can't rely on your pediatrician? There are kids' guardians in a sense, medical guardians. They're the front line for us as parents. A researcher thinks communicating findings is really important, and it's our responsibility as scientists to do it in a way that conveys the messages we want to convey with sensitivity to the various feelings of the audience, and everybody's not coming from the same place. Researchers had other perspectives. I'm not great, I haven't done a great job in publicizing my results. I guess I'm a little shy and I won't go on TV. I did 60 Minutes once years ago. That was kind of fun, but not on autism, and it just took so much time. And I believe that science people will find findings eventually. If you get an article in the paper, it lasts about 2 days. So here was a scientist with very mixed feelings. He had done some promotion, he wasn't comfortable with it, or he or she was not comfortable with it. Another said that honesty picture is trying to say, like, we're all part of a team and it's not them and us, when there's not some sort of cover-up that exists, and researchers' interest in doing this research is sincere, and clearly everyone is doing this because they want to understand what's going on here, to get a better understanding, and not because they're in the pocket of some more controlling entity. You can see, sort of reflections around the vaccine debate seeping into these perspectives here. The sixth theme was about the involvement of persons with autism and their families in research. And you could see that scientists had engaged in some way with individuals with autism as research participants. Blue is individuals with autism, and the green is parents or other family members. So research participants, most scientists had engaged in some way, obviously. But this goes back to your point earlier about how to create a more participatory framework. As co-investigator, barely any. Providing feedback, again, and advisory role, more reliant on parents than on autistics. So that jibes with some of the findings, not the findings of the scientists in your study, but the findings of the autistics in your study. So an autistic adult talks about their job basically to communicate between a more typical scientist and the person who's being looked at and the person who's being studied, and back and forth between the two because there's not any lost information. And you want it to be comfortable for the person who's being studied so they don't panic and things like that. When it gets to panicking, you need someone who understands that, and that's someone who, it's definitely a job for an autistic person. So here you see an autistic adult advocating for that level of participation. And finally, the final theme was around risk communication and infrastructure and the needs of scientists. So this was an interesting finding around perceived institutional pressure to modify publicizing their findings in the following venues. In the press release, almost all of the scientists who responded to this question, which was a smaller subset of our sample, had felt pressured and in terms of the press release, much less so in other venues. But this, even though this number is small, it speaks to some of the discussions that we've had with scientists in the interviews, and I think it also confirms other findings about the pressure that press offices historically have put on scientists regardless of the study, the topic being studied. One researcher says, one thing I want to mention here is that the motivation of a university is really to get buzz for the university. So there is a little bit more of a pull on their part, first of all, to have media coverage when it's not always maybe appropriate, and always to make it, snazzy. I wouldn't say that I've run into a tremendous conflict over this, but even myself, in terms of my success at my university, there's an advantage to have media buzz around my research. So there are these influencing factors that at times run contrary to appropriate messaging, and I mentioned there is a potential. So here is a researcher sort of copping to this dynamic that occurs. We can see individuals or entities, researchers would consult for help in developing a risk communication plan. Despite being pushed by university press offices, most would go there first for help. They would be less likely to go to an outside press or PR consultant, probably because of financial constraints. About half would consult an academic risk communication expert, and about half would consult an autism advocacy group. And in terms of needs and wants for researchers, one researcher says, I would love to have somebody who could help us write and design these sorts of layperson study summaries. I think those are really critical for communicating. They're a great tool, and we just don't have, well, we're completely grant funded, so it's really hard to get that kind of position funded on grants, or at least get the funding from different grants to hire someone like that. Another researcher says, we don't always get it from the perspective of a parent or, someone else on the outside, and I think we just have to be ever mindful of that and think about it in advance. As you're being interviewed by, not as you're being interviewed by a reporter, but as it's tied to that. So we are making recommendations back to Autism Speaks. That was the goal of this project, and that was what they had asked for, about how they should handle their funded projects around risk factor research. So we're making a series of recommendations. First, I'll talk through the general recommendations and then some specific ones. Based on our data, we feel like scientists need to consider the meaning and importance of neurodiversity to autism research. They need to consider the different roles stakeholders might have in autism science. There needs to be discussion about how and when risk information may be useful or harmful. Do the benefits of communicating risk aggressively outweigh the potential harms? We need to explore multiple technologies for communicating risk information, particularly around social media. Should the general public be bombarded with findings from studies with small effect sizes? I was at a conference last fall. Great geneticists gave a talk about some of their findings, but the effect size was so small, yet it was certainly one of those examples where these claims about finding a gene or two for autism could then be propelled into a front-page article about a gene for autism has been discovered. And research findings need to better define populations within the autism community. Not all research findings apply to all autistic people. And then in terms of action items that we're recommending, there needs to be funding and support for media training for researchers and graduate students. This is sort of a baseline. If we want scientists to be better at this, if we want to avoid some of the pitfalls of the past, scientists and graduate students, more importantly, need to be trained in how to talk about their findings to the media so that you don't have the misinterpretations that scientists believe are challenging to the translation of their research into the public eye. Second, funders should require risk communication strategies and actions as part of a grant. So at the outset of a grant, during the grant writing, scientists need to be thinking about how the information, their findings, the risk factors that they may or may not uncover, how should those be communicated to the public in a way that's consistent with the best practices of the field. And the funder should support, as part of grant funding, such infrastructure. And finally, and I think most importantly, and again this goes back to Liz's findings, there needs to be more stakeholder involvement, especially among autistics, and involvement in discussions about risk and what risk means when we're talking about autism. I think that I'm optimistic that, as Liz is, that the rise of ideas around neurodiversity will push this to more of a reality, but I think, from my perspective, we need to keep talking about this, and I'm hopeful that Autism Speaks will adopt some, if not all, of these recommendations. So thank you very much for listening. I appreciate your time.